How that all of these preliminary studies and considerations have cleared the path and clarified our perspective, let us turn to address the formulation of the main problem: the spiritual admissibility of resistance to evil through physical compulsion and suppression. It is clear that the problem cannot be posed until the real, objective quantities hidden behind it are established and identified. How can one talk about evil without having defined or revealed its true nature? What can one say about compulsion if you confuse it with violence and do not recognize its spiritual function, its motives, or its purpose? Is it permissible to refer to the nature of good, believing that its essence is well known, and not noticing that when considered it is often simplified and misrepresented? What can emerge as a result of such failures besides a bankrupt question and a bankrupt answer? But in order to correctly formulate the problem and correctly solve it, we need not only the certainty of a focused perspective. There is still a strenuous attention required to remain focused on that given composition of conditions outside of which the problem itself falls away or is removed. Hence, we do not formulate the problem of the specific weight of steel in order to discreetly replace the steel with iron and then explaining in passing that pig iron is, in effect, ore not determined by specific weight, but rather the absolute weight of a randomly selected piece of ore. Similarly, we do not formulate the problem of the sonata form in order to explain the sonata does not exist at all, that it is impossible to prove its existence, that it is better not to listen to music at all, and that the best thing is the inner self-observation of a deaf person. Every problem has meaning only given particular values and their sound empirical perception. Beyond this, it falls away or becomes meaningless, and then one who still continues to resolve it in this form finds himself in the ridiculous position of a man who is allegedly working on imaginary quantities and then enthusiastically proclaims to have found the truth. To investigate the problem of the permissibility of resistance to evil through physical compulsion and suppression is meaningful only if the following conditions are present. Firstly, there must be a presence of true evil, not its likeness, not a shadow, not a phantom, not an external adversity and heartache, not a delusion, not a weakness, not the illness of a poor sufferer. There must be an evil human will, pouring out in the form of an external act. Before the court of legal consciousness, it must be a will directed against the essence of law and the purpose of law, and since spirituality is the essence of law, and since the existence of the living spirit is the aim of law, it will thus be an anti-spiritual will, by its source, direction, purpose, and means. Confronted with moral consciousness, it must be a will directed against the living unity of the people, and as love is the essence of this union and love is the uniting force itself, it will thus be a will in contradiction to love, by its source, direction, purpose, and means. In every case where such a power contrary to both spirit and love is poured out in an external act, the question will arise of resisting evil by means of suppression. It is clear that this question must be immediately resolved wherever the internal compulsion proves impotent and the evil will acts as an internally possessed external force, that is, where it manifests itself as a spiritually blind malice which is fierce, aggressive, godless, shameless, spiritually corrupt, and which in the face of no means desists, where, consequently, we find the composition of the sentiments and deeds for which the gospel defined the smallest mercy as drowning with a millstone hung around the neck. Matthew 18:6. It is clear that the given interpretation of evil as an ailment, a delusion, a weakness, an accidental fall, and the like, does not resolve but removes the posed problem, and thus all appeals to persuasive non-resistance turn out to be no answer at all, but rather a subtle evasion of the question and the answer. The second condition which must be fulfilled for the correct formulation of the problem is the availability of a correct perception of evil. A perception which, however, does not translate into its acceptance. Even while evil is not accepted by anyone, if no soul has seen either the external act or what is concealed behind it, including the malice therein, then nobody has any grounds or reason to raise and resolve the problem of external resistance. This is why many people, preoccupied with the anticipation of the need for an answer, will underplay evil and prefer not to see it. First evading the looming evidence, then charitably interpreting it in the best light, then hiding behind the impossibility and inadmissibility of judging one's neighbor in faith that wickedness does not characterize the person. It is clear that the man with his back to evil, not seeing, not perceiving, not experiencing, cannot solve the problem, because he extinguishes it in himself, relieves himself of its burden, dulls its severity and resulting anguish, and deprives himself of any right to participate in a discussion of the issue. and consequently all of his judgments on the matter are either incoherent, as the judgments of a blind man concerning complementary colors, or scholastic, as judgments in response to unexplored fictitious circumstances. As to who should and who should not physically stop an atrocity, the only ones competent are those who have seen real evil, who have both perceived and experienced it, those who have received and carried away with them its hellish burns, who did not turn away, but instead looked into the dark gaze of Satan and allowed its image of evil to be truly and faithfully reflected in themselves, yet endured all this without becoming infected, those who perceived evil but rejected it. For the one who accepts evil, he becomes infected with it, and to a certain extent it becomes him, and thereby he transforms from one who must resist to one who must be resisted. Is it possible to solve the problem of the method of resistance? Well, he who has rejected evil has truly known it, but has not become it. He has acquired it as part of his spiritual experience and sees its nature, understands its ways and laws, and is therefore capable of correctly posing and resolving the problem of resistance. Having experienced, rejected, and managed, he thereby acquires the power of vision and the right of judgment. The third condition for correctly posing the problem is the availability of genuine love for good in the interrogative and decisive soul. The problem of resistance to evil is not a theoretical problem, but a practical one. Its formulation, discussion, and judgment suggest that a person not only perceives, contemplates, or goes so far as to study the phenomena and the actions of people, but evaluates them, communicating with them in a living attitude of acceptance and rejection, choosing, preferring, and connecting with his chosen and preferred sense of self, his joy, his life, and his destiny. When there is not much to experience and perceive, one must love and enter into a living identity, finding it necessary to perceive sincerely and genuinely. When there is little to observe, one must be joyous and excited. If a person who does not know the difference between good and evil cannot even see the problem of resistance to evil, then a person who knows this difference but who is indifferent to it can see the problem, but will not be able to formulate or solve it. For the formulation and solution are revealed only to those who take direction from the primary, central sense of their soul, who know it because they cannot but know it, and cannot but know it because the question of good over evil is a matter of their personal being and non-being. The true resistance to evil cannot be reduced to simply assigning blame, and cannot be exhausted by simply rejecting it. No, it puts before a person the question of life and death, demanding from him an answer, whether or not he will live under the yoke of the conquering evil, and if so, how exactly he will live as if this victory had not occurred. If the triumph of blasphemous anti-spirituality and embittered opposition to love does not strangle a person and does not extinguish the light in his eyes, it means that in his soul there is no basis for true comprehension and resolution regarding the problem of resistance to evil. For the problem is formulated as follows: what should one do who truly loves the element of spirituality and love, and, behold, is present to witness their defamation, perversion, and extinction? Are we to consider that perhaps the loveless person is competent to judge the tragedy of the lover? What can the cold and the warm say to the one who receives the divine by burning? Does it make any sense to inquire from the indifferent what he will do if he sees the death of that which he does not care about? This is why when spiritual nihilists and those who are indifferent pose the problem of resistance to evil through physical compulsion and suppression, they remove it from its correct context and give it an imaginary solution. The fourth condition for the correct formulation of the problem is the presence of a rigorous attitude towards the world process in question in a decisive spirit. The practical nature of the question presupposes not only the availability of living love, but also the potential for willful action, and moreover the will to action not only within the limits of one's own identity, but also beyond these limits, in relation to other people, to their evil activities, and to that world process into which they are organically incorporated. This process, if perceived with love and a strong will, appears in the image of a great, evolving struggle in which a living and healthy spirit cannot help but engage on the side of virtue. It cannot but love, not agonizing over decisions and tensions, but promoting virtue and hindering evil. And so, we have no need to ask about what the indifferent may do, for it is utterly ridiculous to raise the question of what the actions will be of one who is innately weak-willed, if such a thing was possible, or one who has voluntarily condemned himself to an artificial lack of will. A person who consciously derives their will from participation in an external environment or blinds themselves to its influence upon the psycho-spiritual life and the activities, body and soul, of others, has no grounds or right to raise and resolve the problem of resisting evil through external compulsion. because from the very start, they extinguish and rob themselves of the mental ability, will, and spiritual orientation to someone else's will, which alone can comprehend this problem. They should not formulate it, because for them it does not exist. It is not worthwhile to find a solution, because it is predetermined for them in a negative sense. And thus, the only way they can faithfully comment on the issue is to openly acknowledge their own incompetence and make the principled decision to refrain from participating in the discussion. Finally, fifthly, the problem of resistance to evil through external compulsion arises and can be correctly posited only if internal, self-inducement and mental coercion are powerless to deter a person from committing crimes. Physical force must be tested as an option when necessary, that is, as practically the only real remedy for a given confluence of circumstances. Beyond this, it makes no sense to pose such a problem. The very essence of the problem is that only two possibilities are given to a person. Only two outcomes, either indulgent inaction or physical resistance. In the first case, seeing that mental compulsion has no effect and that the villainy will still take place, one either stops putting up a fight altogether and moves aside, my HUD is on the periphery, or continues to use this tool, which is certainly doomed to failure. In the second case, he goes beyond mental compulsion and compels or limits the villainous will through physical influence. It is clear that one who puts forward the third outcome and admits or discovers for a given case the utility of self-inducement and mental coercion does not solve the problem, but extinguishes it. He proves not the spiritual prohibition of practically necessary restraint, but its practical uselessness in a certain circumstance, and this removes the problem, bypassing it while not exploring it. These are the basic conditions required for correctly formulating the problem: the genuine presence of real evil, the possibility of its true perception, the power of love in the inquiring soul, the power of will in the exploring and responding soul, and finally, the practical necessity of suppression. The problem can be considered objectively only if the seeker acknowledges that all these conditions are met, and when he in the process of formulation argues them by the power of his consideration, does not lose sight of them unintentionally, and does not dismiss them with conscious affirmation or reinterpretation. The absence of at least one of these conditions renders the question incorrect and the answer illusory. Should I fight evil by means of physical resistance if there is in fact no evil, but instead suffering which only appears to be evil, but raises one to the heights of asceticism? There can only be one answer to this. No, of course you should not. But what use is this imaginary response to a question which abolishes itself? Should I fight evil by means of physical resistance if I do not see evil and do not know exactly of what it consists, whether it ever happens, and if it does, is it occurring now, and where exactly is it occurring? There can only be one answer to this. Until you see and find, you should not. But what value is there in such a reassuring response to the question of a naive or spiritually blind child? Should I fight evil by means of physical resistance if the evil does not harm anything, or harms only what is not valued, what is unloved and such, those things which in fact do not deserve either defense or support and which should be treated with indifference? The answer is beyond question. No, you should not. But what is the significance of this prudently correct answer to such a fearful retort of a question? Should I fight evil by means of physical resistance if my will is dead to all that is external and feels justified in this deadness? If it has no goals and targets beyond myself and my soul, and is not called to anything external? The answer is clear. No, do not. But who could respond to a living spirit with such a deductive answer imposed by the formula of a suicidal question? Should I fight evil by means of physical resistance, where it is equally valid or much more valid to use persuasion, proofs, or appeals to shame and conscience? The answer is indisputable. Of course, you should not. But who will find consolation in this self-evident response, which ignores the tragic depth of the unspoken dilemma? The correct formulation of the problem gives a very different formula to the question, namely, if I see true villainy or the flow of real crimes, and there is no way to prevent a psycho-spiritual effect as a result, and I am truly involved with both love and will starting from divine virtue, not just for me, but for what is external, should I wash my hands, back off, and give the villain the freedom to blaspheme and spiritually destroy? Or must I intervene and stop the evil by physical resistance, going consciously towards danger, suffering, death, and maybe even the diminishment and distortion of my own righteousness?